Notice here that I have listed the unofficial branch of government. So when you read through the Constitution, you get the idea, understandably, that the president would be in charge of the bureaucracy. And that would be the case. However, perhaps because of the expertise and the size of the bureaucracy, which we'll explore in this lecture, the bureaucracy has a great deal of independence and its own sources of power. So here we can see in your text about bureaucracy, the introduction pages, the first 2 pages of the text, goes into some description about what bureaucracy means. And for the most part, there is a negative connotation with bureaucracy. But I would think that there are people taking this class who have family members that work in the bureaucracy at the local, state, or federal level, and that some of you will go on to work in bureaucracy. There's a lot of power in bureaucracy, and there's then opportunities for abuse in bureaucracy as well. It's been observed in the text, and you can find out more about this. You can Google NSA, perhaps arguably the most secretive and powerful bureaucratic agency that we have, the National Security Agency. And they are listening in on many different emails, phone calls, and other communications. Now we see conflicts among bureaucracy and has a real impact on people's lives. For example, some of you are taking this class, you're from Grove, some of you are from Miami. There's been a conflict between different bureaucracies and outcomes regarding Grand Lake and those 2 communities and what they would like out of the water systems in northeastern Oklahoma. Grove, and I think we can see why, would want Grand Lake to be able to have a higher water level. Miami, we can probably see this as well because of the backwater effect during flooding, would not want Grand Lake to have a higher water level. So there we have a conflict. For Grove, this state bureaucracy has been in its corner by and large. The Grand River Dam Authority, it's wanted to have deeper levels for Grand Lake. On the other hand, you have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a federal agency, and they've in many cases been supportive of Miami and wanting to keep the level as it is. Currently, we've seen that GRDA has had the upper hand, been supported by the politicians here in the state of Oklahoma, our members of Congress and senators, and we have started to see a deeper level of water for Grand Lake. And we will only see what impact this has when there will be another flood and how that will be managed in the use of Grand Lake. But again, bureaucracies can limit the power of the president, so it's a fair question to say just how much power does a president have over bureaucracy. And if you consider the size of bureaucratic agencies, if you consider the expertise among many of the bureaucratic agencies, is it possible for one individual and the advisors close to the president to be able to effectively govern and control the bureaucracy? So let's consider these powers of the bureaucracy. I mean, just look at the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, right across the Potomac River in Virginia. And here you can just see that how could one individual be able to effectively control all of this? And that's just a lot of power there in the Defense Department. So many people there, lots of different decisions being made, and the effectiveness of the chief executive would just be limited, and we can just kind of get that idea from the sheer size. And then expertise. How many people have we had as presidents that really had a background in science, had a background in some technical matters that parts of the bureaucracy would be responsible for? And NASA is probably one of the best examples. So, what president could weigh in on what's being done in Mars, for example, by NASA from a technological point of view? And the only one that I could think of that would have been in the ballpark in terms of expertise would have been Jimmy Carter, the president in the 1970s. He had an education and a degree from the Naval Academy in engineering, and he had actually worked in the nuclear submarine program when he was an officer in the Navy. So he would have had some background, but most presidents, that's just not their area of expertise by any means. So we can see how bureaucracies would be able to use their authority, use their skills and their job responsibilities to limit the power of the president. To look at bureaucracy, we can actually use these traits, kind of the signs of a bureaucracy is a way of looking at traits of bureaucracy. And this goes beyond just a government organization. I mean, you can use these traits to think of a major business, a church organization would fit into these categories as well. But hierarchical authority, job specialization, and formalized rules. So hierarchical authority is generally referred to as a chain of command. And you can see this in the military. Perhaps not all parts of the bureaucracy would have a real tall chain of command as this one does. Some of them would have a relatively flat one, but you have somebody in charge and you have other people that know who they're in charge of and who they're responsible to, and that's what you have in a chain of command. If you think of the Navy, we'll just use that as a good example here. Job specialization, and so there would certainly be all kinds of job specialization and all kinds of rules that you have to follow. Some of you perhaps know someone who's worked on the deck of an aircraft carrier, and you have a particular job, a specialized job, and you know exactly where you're supposed to stand, what you're supposed to do at all times. So you have that responsibility as well. And that fits into formalized rules, again, with the Navy. So this is a fantastic movie and worth watching sometimes. It has all kinds of big-time stars from the 1950s, in particular Humphrey Bogart, and actually a man who I believe just passed away not too long ago, Van Johnson. But Humphrey Bogart stars as the captain in the Caine Mutiny, and he's a stickler for the rules, which irritates a lot of people there. But he points out that if you're walking around and below the deck of the ship with your shirt tail hanging out, it's against the rules, and you're going to be penalized. But the reason for that is not just because how it looks, but the fact is that your uniform could now be caught up in equipment because you have narrow passageways in the bowels of the ship, and now you could be hurt. And if you're hurt, you can't do your job. So the importance of following the rules. There's a reason for the rule. And good point. And maybe the rules seem to be rather absurd in some ways, but I think we can also see the importance of those rules as well. Anyways, when we look at bureaucracy, they're referred to as a faceless bureaucrat. We can see, I would think, the importance of being neutral and perhaps not always being empathetic because you have to make a decision. But that doesn't necessarily always fit in bureaucracy, that you would have bureaucrats that would not respond to the needs of the public. But that's an argument that's oftentimes made. So there are times in which that actually is necessary, but there are also many instances where it just doesn't apply. So there's another type of bureaucrat, and that would be the street level bureaucrat. And this would be a bureaucrat who's in contact with the public, who works with the public, who responds to the public, and responds to the needs of the public, and makes many independent decisions. And I think we can see that, especially with police officers, probably the best example, the one that's been studied the most. Just think of all the individual decisions that a police officer has to make on a daily basis, and think of how the police officers are in contact with the public. But you also have wildlife officers, game wardens, for example, and then certainly teachers would be in that category as well. So we also see here that the power of bureaucracy comes from Congress. So once again, on many of the things that we've studied here, we're left with the conclusion that Congress has a great deal of power, and really has more power than the other two branches of government. We've covered the presidency, and we'll soon cover the Supreme Court. But both of those, if Congress chooses, would not have as much power. So here we can see Congress gives the power and the discretion to bureaucratic agencies, called administrative discretion. So they could step in and regulate a bureaucracy more, oversee a bureaucracy. But in most cases, they give the bureaucratic agency the power to make its own rules and regulations. And here, once again, we come back to the iron triangle. So this will be the third time that we've covered the iron triangle. So think back to chapter 11, interest groups, chapter 12, Congress, and now here we are with chapter 14, bureaucratic agencies. So remember how these three organizations interact with one another, and how it can really be a very good example of a sub-government, that these three working together make lasting decisions and impact the government in many ways: interest groups, bureaucratic agencies, legislative committees. Now, within the interactions of an iron triangle, you would have cases in which there would be interest groups that serve a bureaucracy, that go to bat for that bureaucracy, for example, that if there is a threat to cut a bureaucratic agency budget-wise, that you would have businesses and interest groups that represent those businesses that would step forward and say, to Congress, let's find other ways to make cuts, but don't cut this bureaucratic agency because it's very important. And so you would have that interaction within the interest group and the bureaucratic agency. And especially when it comes to defense contracting, this is where we really see this play out. So here in this chart, you're seeing General Dynamics, McDonnell Douglas, General Electric. So just think of the different contracts that they would get with all the major branches of the military, and all the military hardware, and these would be organizations that would certainly benefit from those transactions. And so they would want to make sure that those bureaucratic agencies that they're in contact with and they work with are going to maintain budgetary levels that are conducive for them as well. Here we can see then an interesting question that I think some of you had to tackle with your group project, and to think here of what was the best way to determine how a bureaucrat gets his or her job. Is it based on what they know, which is merit, or is it based on who they know, as you can see there, political patronage? And I would imagine most of us are going to say that it should be based on merit, and that's understandable, and I would agree. However, I think we can also see times in which patronage is worthwhile. Don't elected officials need to have people working that are in some way supportive of them? After all, they won elections. It should be reflective of how they represent the public that voted for them. And so we can see perhaps some reasons for patronage, but most of the jobs, increasingly, we see the need for merit. This was at one time a major issue in the United States. In the 1880s, you had a president actually killed over this issue, and this painting here, this drawing, is showing the unfortunate assassination of President Garfield. He died several months after being shot in the back, and he was shot in the back by a man who was disappointed about not getting a job. This was a time in which at least one day out of the week, a president just had one meeting after another with the public, and people would come in to see the president asking for a job and giving examples of why they deserved a job. And in most cases, the reason why they deserved a job, as far as they were concerned, was because they had campaigned for that president. So there we can see who you know, and the idea then that that should be enough to give someone a job. Garfield was told that Charles Guiteau was unstable and should not get a job, and unfortunately he proved that he was unstable by shooting Garfield. And so this led to a greater demand to have more of the jobs in government based on merit rather than patronage. There are cases in which some bureaucrats are able to more effectively promote their agencies than others, and they're referred to as bureaucratic entrepreneurs. Some agencies are just easier to promote, but one of the best examples of a bureaucratic entrepreneur was J. Edgar Hoover. You know, how many bureaucrats right offhand would you know? And throughout most of American history, most people wouldn't really know a bureaucrat very well, but as director of the FBI for 8 different presidents, J. Edgar Hoover was a well-known individual, and he wanted to be a well-known individual. So he was on newsreels and captured the public's imagination. There were popular films made about the FBI, and so he was able to promote the FBI. He was very effective at doing that, a bureaucratic entrepreneur. Now, this is a very interesting book, and it's been out now for over 60 years, came out in the 1950s, and it's still very relevant if you follow the idea that a bureaucracy, a bureaucratic agency, has a life of its own, that it's an organic being. And I think that's a very interesting concept. It's something that it always captures my imagination, the idea that a bureaucratic agency has a life, that it wants to survive, just like a human being wants to survive, just like a house cat wants to survive. So it is wanting to, it has an appetite so it can fulfill its hunger and get energy, that it has goals, that it has survival skills to try to be able to survive. And so bureaucratic agencies, if they are threatened, find ways to survive. And that may mean that they don't necessarily solve problems if solving problems mean that the agency goes away, or they have to find new problems. Now, before we become too negative about that, consider that. How would you respond if you were hired for a job and then you were told, now as soon as you complete this task, you won't have a job anymore? How exactly would you respond? So it's probably not too surprising that bureaucratic agencies try to figure out ways for them to survive, and the people that work in them try to figure out ways to survive. So with that in mind, how does Congress and the presidency work to try to reform bureaucracy if necessary? A bureaucratic agency, for example. And some of the ways in which that might be done would be to combine agencies, privatization, or transparency. So combining agencies, since agencies have different power bases, we can imagine that if you combine those, somebody is giving up a power base, and that's not very frequent or very likely to happen without a fight. There were movements after World War II, and even during the latter stages of World War II, that there was no need for the Navy to have its own ground troops. And some of you know what that meant to hear the term ground troops in the Navy. That's United States Marine Corps. That the Marine Corps could be now part of the Army instead of the Navy. Well, not too surprisingly, the Navy did not take that sitting down and has been, of course, fighting that. And consider the power base of the U.S. Navy. They have, because of the Marine Corps, the ability to have input in places where there's no shoreline, like Afghanistan. And so they have an input there, even though if you look at a map, you would be led to believe that the Navy would not have power. So combining agencies, that's just a very, maybe a different type of example than what you might find in some other cases. There are situations in which agencies do get combined, but we can see that it would in many cases involve quite a fight to go that direction. Privatization, some of you had your discussions on this as well. It does reduce the number of bureaucrats, state employees. It doesn't necessarily save money because you're now shifting the money over to a private organization, and the private organization must in fact make a profit in order for it to exist. And so we can see here that privatization may not be the best route, but are there situations in which the private organization that does need to make a profit can deliver a better service than the public bureaucracy? And so that's the ongoing debate about privatization. Transparency, that you have to make the actions of the bureaucratic agency public. Now the issue there is to say and to consider, what about some bureaucratic agencies and their role and their mission? If in fact they now have to inform the public what they're doing, could that in fact reduce their ability to accomplish their mission? And if that's the case, then how is that serving the public? This becomes a conflict, as we can see. So in other words, is transparency always a good thing? So the Central Intelligence Agency, should it always be transparent? Are there things that it's doing that it just simply can't share with the public? And if it did, it would reduce its ability to accomplish its mission. And if it wasn't able to accomplish its mission, it would actually harm the public more. So there's the conflict. Now, I've had some students tell me that they've researched this quote and it wasn't really attributed to George Orwell. So we'll just keep that in mind. But Orwell, someone who I'm very much a fan of, a English writer in the early part of the 20th century up to the middle part of the 20th century, had this to say, as you can read through that quote, about the reality of our lives and the people who make our lives possible. And so do we need to perhaps sometimes look the other way when it comes to actions that are being done on our behalf? And so is transparency always what we need? All right, a couple of other points here to make about bureaucracy. One thing is the power of bureaucracy, and it's the ability to implement, to put a policy into action. And that's one way to interpret the term implementation, to put a policy into action. So no matter how a policy is worked out by lawmakers, let's say, or high-level bureaucrats who have an ability to create this policy, it's going to be carried out by people who, in some cases, when it comes to warfare, literally have their boots on the ground. And can the policy be implemented? Can it be carried out? It's one thing to put a policy together in an air-conditioned room in Washington, D.C., but if it's warfare in Iraq, the policy is carried out in 120-degree temperatures with all kinds of winds and sandstorms. Does that in fact mean that you can carry out that same policy? can be said with education. People might have a certain policy about education, but it's the teacher in the classroom facing the students that has to carry out that policy. So does the policy make sense on paper and at the same time in real action? And there we can see again where what is intended may not work. There are some bureaucratic agencies that have a great deal of support, perhaps based on what role they have and how they benefit the public. A good example would be Social Security. They're by and large very supported by the public. There are other bureaucratic agencies that are not so much supported, such as FEMA. But perhaps it's based upon the role and the responsibilities of the individual agency. So let me show you what I mean by that. This is the responsibility of FEMA. So just read through that. And so when you read through that and consider the role of FEMA, the responsibility of FEMA, is it possible that any agency could be given this task and could walk away from it and still have a positive image and support among the public? There's reasons to think that it's a task that's just not going to generate a great deal of support. Within bureaucratic agencies, you have whistleblowers, and I think I'll just leave that here for you to consider. But another question, we're left with a lot of questions on bureaucracy. Once again, if the whistleblower is the whistleblower providing a valuable service by letting us know what's not working within a bureaucratic agency or what's going against the Constitution? In the case of Edward Snowden in the NSA, you can see Edward Snowden's picture there on the left. But once again, if a whistleblower is damaging the ability of the bureaucratic agency to accomplish its mission, whose needs are being served in that case? And so there we can see these conflicts and questions about whistleblowers. I'll leave you in the last couple of slides here to just think about the responsibilities of a bureaucratic agency. Here's the example of the National Transportation Safety Board, and that their job is to try to evaluate what happened in a plane crash. And perhaps in some cases an almost impossible task, because in many cases what they have to do is put the plane back together. And so they're left with these issues here of what would cause an accident. Now notice the incentive to be pulled one way or the other, and this is the need to have a neutral, balanced bureaucratic agency. Because if it's human error, the plane companies would like that, right? They could now blame it on somebody manning the plane, even though that could be their employee. But it's not the plane itself, which would be the second possibility, right? And there's no chronological order here, it's just different possibilities. Machine error. So perhaps attorneys representing victims' families may want that reason for the accident, or that it's completely out of control of the people in charge of the plane or the companies themselves, and it's the environment. But we can see here then that before you've investigated the crash, there's going to be incentives, there's going to be motivations to try to persuade, lobby, think of Chapter 11, lobby those bureaucratic agents on how they make the decision. And so this is why almost every bureaucratic agency would have inspector generals whose job is to investigate the investigators and to see if in fact they were neutral and how they were making their decision. And this is a Latin quote. I'm not going to attempt to become a Roman here and say this in Latin, but it just lets us know that for thousands of years, this question's been around. Who will watch the watchers? And so the need then to have an inspector general. A lot to say about bureaucracy. We'll stop it there, and we'll have one more chapter after this dealing with the Supreme Court.